I'm going to introduce you to Ren. Ren is going to be our facilitator for this session, and away we go.
Thanks, Rob. My name is Rin, or Jaryn, Holbrook, Janeway. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Director of Programs and Operations at OutYouth. And relevant to this, not a shameless plug, well, maybe a little bit of both. The co-author of Trans Plus, Love, Sex, Romance, and Being You, a growing up guide for trans and non-binary youth and all the people who love them. Today, I am joined by two wonderful colleagues that will help us dig into the ethics of gender-affirming care. It would be my preference that if you have a question at any point, raise your hand. I would much rather this be an open conversation. I am sure we'll get to the points that we have been asked to address today in the CEUs, which, bravo, that is a nightmare on another level. But I would rather make sure that your questions are answered today leaving. Cool? Cool. I'm going to pass it off to the rest of the panel. Maddie.
Hi, I just want to make sure y'all can hear me. My name is Maddie, Domin, Madison, Maddie, whatever you prefer. I use she, they pronouns. I am an LMSW here in Texas, meaning I am a Master of Social Work, currently under supervision to become a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Texas. Yeah, that's me.
Hey everybody, can you hear me? Awesome. My name is Kelle Martin. I use he, him, they, them pronouns. I'm the executive director of allgo. Allgo is an organization that celebrates and nurtures queer and trans people of color through programming rooted in social justice, health and wellness, and the cultural arts.
Thank you both. We're going to start today with probably the most important question when you have a panel like this about gender affirming care. What is gender affirming care?
Well, gender affirming care is the acknowledgement of an individual's identities and not necessarily trying to fit them into a box, but allowing them to self-identify and allowing them to use their preferred, like what they want to go by, and not necessarily trying to make them fit in with our societal norms. And I think the most important aspect of that is just creating a gender affirming environment. And that's one that acknowledges one's experience and doesn't try to put your own points of view onto the person receiving services.
Yeah, absolutely. And putting like a mental health care kind of focus on it. Gender affirming care in a mental health space looks like allowing the client to tell you how they want to be met that day. That's maybe specific to the name they want to use that day, the pronouns they want to use that day, or if they even want to talk about gender, right? Yeah, that's my viewpoint on it.
I'm going to echo what Maddie said. So I think that's very important for you all to understand, especially mental health folks in the room. As a person of trans experience myself, I went through years and years of therapy. And when you spend that much time in therapy talking about that piece of your identity, you know, sometimes you just want to go to therapy and talk about how much you hated that movie you saw on Saturday or that bad date you went on Tuesday. Like, it doesn't always have to go back to gender, but something very interesting to note. There is often a misconception about the gendered spaces that trans people occupy, that we all occupy. So for example, many years ago, OutYouth ran a campaign called Take My Hand, Texas, launched in 2017 when Senator Lois Kolkhorst had introduced a bill that was going to ban trans people, and then later just trans kids in public schools, from using restrooms. As part of developing that campaign, one of our board members, very well-intentioned, asked me, well, aside from like bathrooms and locker rooms, like what other gendered spaces are we talking about? The world. And it had just so happened that that morning, as I was leaving to go to the meeting about the campaign, a UPS driver showed up at my house and was dropping off a package, handed it off to me, turned around, and as they were leaving, said, "Have a great day, ma'am." Even outside my own front door, I encounter gender. And sometimes I even encounter it inside my own house. Thankfully, the pets don't know how to use pronouns. Some other notes of importance here. Gender affirming care is life-saving. That cannot be underestimated. In fact, recent research, 2020, published in Pediatrics, shows that for trans teens who receive puberty blockers, we can dive into those and their specifics later, their risk of suicidality drops by 70%, 70. These are life-saving interventions that are medically proven, evidence-based, and backed by major medical organizations that represent over 1.3 million doctors in the United States. This is not fringe science. This is not experimental. We know more than I think we've ever known in human history, I think is fair to say. Even though there were efforts along the way, especially during World War II, to erase the progress that had been done. So gender affirming care is critical. I was told I had to make this point. Gender affirming care should always be delivered in an age appropriate and evidence-based way. Why do I say that? Because there's so many people out there saying that 7-year-olds are getting surgery. That is not happening. It's not happening. What we are doing for 7-year-olds, actually, Maddie, do you mind if I turn to you and ask you what might happen with a 7-year-old?
Yeah, of course. I have some experience working with all ages of trans people. With a 7-year-old, we just want to talk to them. I think one of the biggest things that occurs is there's some confusion that happens with parents, how that happens so young. There's been studies shown that the idea and concept of gender can be developed, it's leaving me, as young as like 4 or 5?
I was aware at 3.
3 to 5 is right around when the concept of gender develops. And if you think about developmentally within children at that age, what stage children are at, right? They're just trying to figure out the world, right? Whether that's through attachment, whether that is through literally exploring the world, right? At that age, my role as a social worker and as a mental health provider, one is to make sure they have the resources they need, whether that is someone to talk to, like a mental health professional, a doctor that can help the parents understand what's going on a medical side, and honestly just space, right? Like meeting other trans kids and meeting other trans adults as well. My experience working with the younger population is that they only want to meet trans adults. I ran a group, and one of the things that I heard that was heartbreaking is, I think it was like a 13, 14-year-old was like, I don't see anything past 18. Like, what do I do past 18? And one of the biggest conversations we had to have is like, trans people do exist, right? Past 18. In my adult groups that I took part in, we had trans people up to the age of 65, right? And these kids just wanting to know that it is possible. It's not a death sentence. So that's my viewpoint on it. Yeah.
I know that we are here today to talk about HIV. You're probably not dealing with a bunch of 7-year-olds who are trans that have HIV. I understand. But considering that most of the dialogue around trans and non-binary people in the last year, especially in this state, has been around kids, we wouldn't have been doing our job had we not addressed that. Something very important to bring to the conversation before we move ahead. I am a 38-year-old trans person who was diagnosed with HIV in 2010. And we can get into some specifics of my experience around gender and treatment, but we're going to try to keep this as general as possible. Backing up, there is a range of services that are gender affirming. Most people think of medical, so hormone replacement therapy, going to see a doctor, perhaps scheduling a surgery, which is not required to be valid as a trans person. Mental health care, which Maddie has covered, and social services. One of the biggest things that trans folks need access to that is most difficult are the social services. And so making sure that your environments are open and affirming of trans people. And I am not saying bend over backwards. In fact, as a trans person, if I walked into a social services provider and it just was trans everywhere, I would feel real weird. In fact, I have a vet that I go see, and when I walked in the other day, rainbows everywhere. I was like, I'm glad that I can be safe here, but this feels intentional in a way that is uncomfortable. So if you ever have a question as a non-trans person about how it feels, ask a trans person. If they get mad at you, ask a different trans person. It doesn't have to be complicated. Maddie also brought up a really interesting point, and I'm curious to see how this is played out in both of your work. Language. Language in the trans community changes all the time. So what advice do you have for folks in the room who are providing gender affirming care and are afraid of saying the wrong thing?
I think just not, if you make a mistake, don't make that the biggest part of the conversation. Apologize, ask for clarity, and move on. But I think the most powerful thing you can do is putting the power in the client's hands. Let them identify, let them self-identify. Maybe I guess a proactive thing to do is to share your pronouns and then allowing them to take the reins and show you what they want to get out of that interaction.
Yeah, I agree completely. One of my practices, anytime I meet a new person, I'm like, hi, my name's Maddie, I use she, they pronouns. What are your pronouns, right? Recognizing that like gender is fluid, not just in the sense of like the definition of gender, but also like an individual person's gender can change from one day to another, right? That's why we have such a wide spectrum. I allow my clients to like let me know if anything changes, right? Like I've had clients who are trying to figure out their name and like will come every day and be like, this is what I want my name to be today. And I'll be like, cool. And I'll like try to drop it a couple times so that they can hear it and feel it. Yeah, I think language is a big thing. It is always changing. I'm pretty young in this field and I've been taught a lot of things by young people, to the point where I'm like Googling during a session being like, what is that word, right? Remaining curious and also like checking your sources is the number one thing that I would say. But yeah, remaining curious, even if it's just like, hey, out of curiosity, you said this word. And this is like a mental health practice, but being like, what is your definition of that word? Just so we can make sure our definitions are lined up, there's no miscommunication, and we can continue this seamlessly. Yeah, language is big because as humans, that's the way that one brain talks to another brain, right? It has different experiences trying to figure it out. But yeah.
This is always very controversial when I say it out loud, but I mean it. You have my permission to get the language wrong. You do not have my permission, taking off my OutYouth hat, to be an asshole about it. Don't do it intentionally. But if you have made an honest mistake, you have my permission to make that mistake. Question. Raise your hand if you are familiar with my very dear friend, Ms. Frizzle. Cool. For those of you who have not had the pleasure, Ms. Frizzle was the main character in a series of children's books I grew up with called The Magic School Bus. She was a 4th grade teacher who, for some reason that was never explained in the books, was given her own school bus. She would often take her students on the school bus to go on magical adventures to learn things like about space or how volcanoes worked. That one time they shrunk down and went inside Arnold's body without his consent. I didn't say it was a good book series, I just said that it was there. Anyway, before they would go on an adventure, every time Ms. Frizzle would stand at the front of the bus and say, class, what are we gonna do? We're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna take chances. We're gonna get messy. That's allyship, folks, especially with trans folks. If you are not taking the chance to engage and use the language, you're not trying, frankly. You're gonna make mistakes and you're gonna get messy, but even Ms. Frizzle messed it up because what did she forget? You have to learn to clean up after yourself. And that's what Maddie is referring to. There's this piece of the practice of repairing the relationship after. And you have to be prepared that you may not be able to repair the relationship. That sucks. If that happens and you need to talk about it, give me a call. I'm happy to talk through it with you. But if you're not taking the chance, we are not leaving our spaces open to the experiences of the people who are coming to us for help. Because ultimately, isn't that why they are approaching us? They need our help, want our help. Fancy. We'll move on to the next question. Because this has been such a hot button topic, especially in Texas this year, can either of you believe that this was just months ago? It feels like it was a decade ago. How do laws now conflict with our ability to provide gender affirming services?
Well, now we aren't. What we can do is acknowledge the experiences of trans folks and continue to offer them a supportive, gender-affirming environment. And so what that looks like is, things that we've talked about previously, creating an environment where they feel safe and the power is in their hands. That's what I can say. I defer to organizations like Equality Texas and Texas Education Network of Texas, Trans Education Network of Texas, ACLU, for more guidance on laws, because it's the wild, wild west here in Texas. And so we need to name that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of want to talk about like the individual things, right? Like here in the state of Texas, our younger siblings, our younger trans siblings are constantly under attack, have been for years. That's probably not going to end anytime soon, even though we want to grab like politicians and just shake them and be like, this person is a human, right? Not a number, this person is a human. With my experience working with a lot of different ages, I have both mental health experience as well as social services experience, meeting directly with trans people one-on-one, trying to get them the resources they need to make their life as easy and as comfortable and as joyous as possible. With that being said, right, this past legislative session was hard, right? It caused a lot of pain to the queer community as a whole, right? We see history repeating itself, just in a different font, right? And the number one thing that I've seen make my practice harder is that like a lot of people are grieving, y'all. Like a note on ambiguous loss, right? Like no one died. Well, a lot of people died. People die. But in an individual's life, no one directly, single person died that's causing palpable grief, right? Instead, we are grieving the loss of rights, right? This ambiguous thing that everybody should have, just like outright, right? That's why it's called rights. I just said rights so many times. But it's like it's a loss, right? And losing someone is a soul murder, right? You have to learn what your life looks like afterwards. You have to learn what's going to be new, what's going to be different, what's going to continue to hurt. I hurt for my trans siblings every single day, right? I hurt all day, every day, meeting with clients. It's changed a lot. There are certain things I can't do anymore. I can't give specific resources depending on somebody's age, right? Getting specifically gender affirming medical care here in the state of Texas, if you're under the age of 18, like the best we can do is be like, hey, how can we figure out how to meet your mental health needs? And if you have the resources, how can we get you an appointment out of state, right? I don't want to end it, but let's figure out how we can make it work around your life, right? I had clients who were counting down to the day they turned 18, right? And sometimes that's all you can do. But my viewpoint is working with the clients to make them feel safe in a state that they are not safe, right? And that's just a lot of internal work. It's a lot of community work. There are certain things that have changed in like what I can and can't say to people. what I can and can't say in regards to being afraid of losing my license, which is a really scary thing. But when it comes to my siblings, right, my trans siblings, that's the least of my concerns. I want to make sure people are okay. That's my ethical responsibility as a social worker and as a person, right? Just making sure people are okay. Yeah, do you want to add?
I just want to also just talk about the intersectionality of all this when you throw in the trans experience along with one's racial identity, the barriers to services, the barriers to any support are significantly increased. And I just wanted to add that to what Maddie said, because we always have to think about intersectionality and how that affects one individual experience and makes everything that much more complicated.
Again, I know that we keep focusing on youth, and I know there's going to be at least one person in the room like, why do we keep talking about youth? I serve 27-year-olds. These youth are going to be your clients. And if you are not aware of this trauma that they have experienced now, you are not going to fully understand why they may not fully trust you when they come to see you for services later. Most notably, so that we are all, oh yes, go ahead.
I work with seniors, and I'm finding the most hostile environments are for trans seniors going to nursing.
Correct.
I'm getting calls all the time about having clinical meetings before they come into the facility to explain to the whole staff why their sex does not match their genitalia, which is not the conversations you have normally when a new senior comes into a nursing home. And it's just an extremely unsafe place, and they really feel like there's no place they can go to get help because they don't have a lot of friends, at times they don't have a lot of support. So if you guys can give any suggestions on things that I can give to my trans seniors to help them kind of deal with these issues.
Absolutely. I'm going to repeat for those joining us virtually. The question was, how do we better support trans seniors in nursing homes when many of the staff are not well prepared? And these trans seniors often don't have support networks like other seniors might. It must be acknowledged that the average life expectancy for a trans woman of color is 30. When I work with trans youth, they all want to meet trans adults, and it is strange to have a repeat experience as someone who came out as a gay boy in high school and didn't have elders because all the gay men in my community had passed away during the epidemic. To now go through that again and not have my own trans elders, it's not surprising, unfortunately, that that has happened. Do you all have any recommendations?
I can give a shot at it. I don't work with seniors. I have immense respect for people who do work with seniors. This is something I do want to dive into clinically as I continue on into my career. I think something that's important to recognize that Jaryn did say is recognizing the familial rejection that could have happened, right? So when we say that they don't have a support network, we don't just mean other trans people, we mean people, right? So whether that is a child, a sibling, people who are trying to help this person into a care facility, that may have been lost. Familial rejection is something that anybody in the queer community, queer and trans community, can experience at an incredible rate. That has never changed. And whether that is society, religion, or anything that people choose to demonize and weaponize towards our siblings, that's their choice. I believe in self-determination, but recognizing that it's not just other trans people. Here's what I will say as someone who also offers services to people, right? You really have to be willing to be a fierce advocate. Like, I understand ruffling feathers can be very nerve-wracking. I understand that trying to obtain and hold on to a working relationship is important. The one thing I will say as a caring professional, your number one concern is your clients, right? So if that is looking at someone and being like, honestly, their genitalia not matching their gender marker is none of your business, then that's what you just have to say, right? And you have to continue to work that and make sure your client knows and gives permission for you to do that because you don't want to take that power away, right? But don't falter on that. And if you need more education, reach out to like the Trans Education Network, other organizations that are willing to give education. If your client is willing to give you education, absolutely. They are the professional on themselves. They know the most about themselves out of anybody, right? But also don't put that burden on them. Don't be like, well, ask the client. Well, ask the client, because no one wants to be like, well, yeah, I'll tell you about my genitalia, right? Be a fierce advocate. Create a care team that isn't just a advocate and somebody who works at the facility. Maybe it be another organization that comes in, right? Maybe you find a support group for trans seniors or for trans adults that they can have access to, whether that is virtual, in person, exploring those options as well. But yeah.
Yeah, you can reach out to organizations such as Tent and Allgo. We offer type of like teach-ins and like at least normalizing the language around how to talk about these seniors in a way that humanizes them and not doesn't just objectify them on, you know, body parts. And just, I think that would be a very, you know, initial conversation. Once people are more familiar with the language and know how to treat those clients with dignity and respect, then maybe the behavior could be addressed after that. So I think some other resources besides ACLU, Equality Texas, Tent, Transgender Law Center campaign, and the Campaign for Southern Equality are also some resources you could reach out to for resources.
So speaking of resources, one of the wonderful things about this conference is that we have those resources in the room. And so I'm going to come here real quick to our folks over at Connections out of Family Elder Care, who exists solely to serve our older adults and our LGBTQ community. And that is something, this very topic is one that they have delved in very heavily. So I just want to give them a chance to voice in on this.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. My name is Cheryl Young. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a clinical social worker, and I am the manager of Rainbow Connections ATX. And along with my coworkers, Richard Bondi and world famous Bob, we do focus on support of the older LGBTQ community, where they are, where they're, you know, hoping people live and thrive where they are. And one of the things that Richard and I do is educational programs throughout the state. We're actually going to the On Aging Conference to do that in March. And I think that to me is the primary focus here, is that, you know, for so many years, the trans community is not new. What's I think is different, and we're in the growing pains process of people not going back in the closet when they're going to facilities and not changing, you know, having to deny who they are. And so I think that's where we are right now. And so I'm encouraged by that, the things like that you're saying, the difficulty, you're having to work through that. And I think that is wonderful, not for the person that's going through that, but there's always those of us that have been on the cutting edge have had to deal with that throughout society. And I think that it's important to educate the facilities. And I mean, that's something that we are trying to, you know, encourage other people to do. Well, it's a slow process. It really is. But I mean, that's one of the things, you know, one of the things that we talk about when we do educate is, think about it. If you work in a facility and someone comes in and they present as a woman and have male genitalia, then what are you going to do with that? What room are you going to put them in? How are you going to deal with bathing when they're non-ambulatory or not able to care for themselves? What's going to happen when they get dementia and start to maybe revert back to a previous lifestyle that they don't necessarily haven't lived in 40 years? And so all of those things is bringing things to light. I've talked with a trans woman who's a friend of mine. She never even thought about that. You know, she has means. And so she never thought about, well, what would it look like if I have to go into a facility? And so I think it's about education and opening people's eyes and dealing with things that people really aren't used to dealing with. And so it is difficult, but I think it's baby steps and working through that education process.
Hi, I just wanted to let you know that Brookdale Lakeway actually has a clinical program that takes care of people after they have transition surgery. It is not well known because they don't like to draw attention to it, but as a clinical resource, you might want to reach out to them because they have they have a great team that really cares about their patients. And I think I would highly advise you reach out to them. Wonderful. Yes, that would be in there, and that's for the nursing home.
Yeah, and Brookdale is also SAGE certified, so as is Rainbow Connections ATX. So that's another great resource, is SAGE out of New York, that they certify folks to be LGBTQ certified. You know, you get your stamp and your sticker and you say, our staff is trained. And so that is one of the things that Charles Curry and the city have been working toward, is trying to create a way that communities can get their certification, because it's kind of difficult. It takes, you know, in order to get your platinum, you have to train all the staff. We know turnover in our communities. Someone who's here today is not going to be there tomorrow. And so it's the constant rotation. Yet there is a version that all of the executives can get trained in, and you do get your certification. And so trying to work with these communities through the city to make that something that's viable as well.
One thing that cannot be left out of this conversation is what marginalized communities have done forever, which is things for us, by us. And so there are communities across the United States that have taken it upon themselves to create elder care homes that are run by us, for us. I am curious if anyone is aware of an initiative in Austin to do that. All right, we need to talk because I have ideas.
Well, you know, that was Betty Naylor's dream. And for those of you who don't know, Betty Naylor started LGRL, which is now Equality Texas. She was a female advocate who was in the 80s up at the lobbying for us at a time when we were reviled by our elected officials. Yet she still went to the Capitol every day and advocated for us, and it became the rights organization. And when she passed, her wife and family donated money to create the Betty Naylor Fund, which lives at Family Elder Care, with the goal of being able to raise the money to build a retirement community specifically for our community. So that's been a dream quite a while.
There's one in the works. There's developers that are looking into specifically serving LGBTQ plus community, and it is happening. Not as quickly as we would like, but it is happening.
Well, that's awesome to hear. And it's affordable housing.
And then there's also Law Harrington in Houston.
Yes.
So, and because it's subsidized, probably now I think like 70% are heterosexual because they can't discriminate because it's subsidized, but at least give some people that want to live in a more safe space to go.
And, you know, to Cheryl's point, it's those baby steps, but it's that visibility that's happening, I think, is making people realize, hey, this is needed. So that's great to hear.
Let's dive into some specifics around the law. Senate Bill 14 became effective on September 1st after a lengthy legal fight and lots of creative attempts to block it, which unfortunately failed. Texas was not alone though. 48 out of 50 states have considered some sort of trans healthcare ban. 19 other states managed to make one effective this year. In Texas, it bans puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy for anyone 17 and younger. It also bans the use of public assistance to provide these services to anyone 18 or younger. There have been specific carve-outs, because of course there were. The bill itself is about 11 pages. It gets into a lot of detail about what's not allowed. So in short, puberty blockers, HRT surgery. But there is a lengthy section in the bill that allows for surgery on children if they are intersex. That's totally okay. Not okay. Let's be very clear. That is, my position is it's bad. But the state has decided that no surgery for gender affirmation except when the child can't consent. It is also, and this is not well known and should be, the bill forced youth who were already on hormone replacement therapy to wean off hormone replacement therapy unless it would be medically detrimental or dangerous, which it is to wean off, is my position. I'm not a doctor. Absolutely. Let me finish this last point. It also, like Maddie said, provides punishment for doctors and other healthcare professionals who provide this kind of support to anyone 17 or younger, threatens them with losing their license and their livelihood for affirming our kids. Intersex. So most folks are aware of a binary sex designation of male and female, but because nature is nature and biology is biology, it is a spectrum. Usually shows up in chromosomes. There's many different chromosomal makeups, so you may be familiar with XX and XY. Some intersex folks may have an X chromosome, 3 X chromosomes, sorry, I'm not as an expert on that as I should be. But it is a spectrum there, and what always seems to shock people is that intersex folks are not rare. 1 in 2,000 people is intersex, which means there are more intersex people in the world than there are redheaded people. Just like our community, they are everywhere as well. So the state specifically carving out this allowance to correct the genitalia surgically of babies, and I'm not trying to be alarmist there, it happens on babies, usually shortly after birth. Gross. That's still okay because the whole idea is to make us normal, right? We just want everybody to be normal and stop making life difficult, is generally the approach of the Republican Party. OutYouth head off. I also want to point out, OutYouth head off. 85% of Republicans in the state of Texas support this kind of legislation, with 17% of Democrats also supporting. Almost 1 in 5 Democrats support a ban on trans healthcare for children, which was extremely disappointing when I found that out. Trying to decide which question I want to go to next. Let's go here. Oh, yeah, so 85% of Republicans support gender affirming care bans, 17% of Democrats, or 1 in 5. And of course, that one stat that somebody asked about, I didn't write down the source of, but I think it was Texas Tribune. In 2022, actually almost exactly a year ago, the Texas Attorney General sent a sweeping order to the Department of Public Safety asking for a list of people who had changed their gender on their driver's license or any other documentation related to the Department of Public Safety. We all know what happens when governments start to make lists. Let's be clear. There is nothing that would stop Texas, especially the folks who don't like people like me, from coming in and trying to get your records too. Now, are there things that you could do, fight them off with every last bit of your strength? Absolutely. Are there laws in place that should prevent this? Yes. But this is not a time to mess around with, well, we can go to court. Yeah, of course you can. But that's not good enough for our trans folks. So the question is, how do you collect information about the trans people that you're serving? How do you use it and how do you protect it, knowing that we are not all playing by the same rules when it comes to accessing that information?
Let me give that a go. So as a social worker and as a mental health professional, I fall underneath two specific things that I want to keep in mind. HIPAA, very important, and two, the social work code of ethics. As a social worker, you are taught the code of ethics are like the holy grail, the Bible, it's what you follow. With that being said, there is a lot of contradictions within it, right? As if there is in any other ethical text, right? That's the world we live in. Nothing can be written down and made perfectly for us to follow. We are humans. We are all imperfect, right? Under HIPAA, people can't have access to that without specific request, whether that's an ROI, whether that is a HIPAA release form. Me personally, I take my clients' information as they give it to me. I can't be like, I know that's not your legal name, right? Because I don't know. I don't know. I collect and call them by what they want to be called, right? I do have to get certain things like date of birth, right? But not a lot of people hide that for a gender affirming reason. I don't know your business, right? I don't report on grants. As a mental health professional, that's not something I personally do in my current practice. I have had experience with that, but everything is about protecting the privacy of my client. In our world, there is a lot of attacks on privacy all the time. For example, getting this list. As someone who has extensive backgrounds in assisting people with changing their name and or gender marker change, this was scary. This was very scary. But it's an invasion of someone's privacy. And my ethical responsibility as a social worker is that can't happen on my hands, right? And it won't. Hopefully, I do mess up. I hope not to though. But that's me personally. I do want to get your point of view on this.
Well, Maddie did touch on using, HIPAA. So making sure we use jot form and things that protect our clients' privacy. Another thing, we collect the information in the same way. We don't pry once we have the information we need for funding, credentials, birthday, name that they provide. We use that information at face value as well, and we do the same when we're reporting for audits or anything like that. We use numbers. We don't actually share anything that we don't have to share with our funders. We provide information that is, just baseline, nothing invasive, and that's what we do at allgo.
Just so happens that I am technically in charge of this piece of the work at OutYouth. Do not use paper, if at all possible. Why? Anyone familiar with Watergate? It may sound alarmist, but I don't trust that in the middle of the night, the state would not try to break into OutYouth and steal all of our physical files, because it would be very easy to do. We're in a 100-year-old house. You breathe wrong on the front door, it's going to cave in. Like, it's not going to be difficult. So no paper if you can help it. which means that you're keeping all of this information digitally. So, number one rule there, do not ask for something that you do not need to know. Unless you're doing grant reporting, we'll get to that in a second. If you're using these online systems, you must enforce strong passwords. I'm not talking 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not talking password backwards. I'm talking like 16 character passwords with the 2-factor authentication. I know that these are big nerd words. Good password, that thing where your phone texts you with a code that you have to enter, or whatever. These things are not optional anymore. And as Maddie said with HIPAA, if you are not the tech person, your number one goal going back to work on Monday, ask whoever it is that's in charge of all the internets, if you have a BAA, a business associate agreement in place with any software provider that you use to store or transmit client data. So for example, at OutYouth, that would be Podio, our client management system, Therapy Notes, our clinical management system, email, Slack, like any place that you are sharing client information, internal information, you should have those business associate agreements in place. Why? That is a contract between you and the data service provider that says that they are going to store your information in compliance with HIPAA on not a less publicly accessible server, is probably the easiest way to say that. Got it? This is not a time to mess around with people, and it's never been the time to mess around with people's confidential information, now more so than ever. Grant reporting. I hope you are doing anonymized grant reporting. I would assume that that is a requirement of all of your granting sources, but never share data sets. Oh, Charles is in the room. I was about to tell a fun story. So Charles and I served on the City of Austin's LGBTQ Quality of Life Commission together, and we did a quality of life study. Almost 3,000 people replied. I asked for the data set afterward because we wanted to make it available to the community on the open data portal. And so they sent it to me with identifiable information in it. The City of Austin, not trying to drag them, just trying to point out that even the City of Austin, with all of its guards and protections, forgot to send me the redacted version. Like, you can't just be sending around spreadsheets. That is not how this works. Always get somebody to double check that you are not sharing identifiable information, because it is not difficult in this day and age. My husband is one of those, you know, when your phone is like, hey, I heard you talking about Red Bull yesterday. Here's some Red Bull ads. That's my husband. Sorry. There are scarily easy ways to track your data and client data back to who they are, where they live, what time they're at certain places. It's a very scary time with relation to data tracking. On a lighter note, many or all of you are HIV service providers. You may be thinking to yourself like, oh gosh, now we have to do gender affirming care too. No. No, we are not asking you to go home and on Monday open up a hormone replacement therapy clinic. Please don't. Please don't. There are so many wonderful places to get care here in Austin, around the state, and across the nation. So, where should people send their folks if they need gender affirming care?
Are we talking specifically about like hormone replacement?
Any of it. So medical, mental health, social services.
Yeah, of course. Kind Clinic is great. Incredibly accessible. Shout out to Kind Clinic. Woot woot. Hey guys. I worked with Kind Clinic very closely. They're great. It's amazing over there. They have a lot of resources. When it comes to mental health care, I would shout out OutYouth. There are programs in place that do provide mental health care, whether that is support groups, individual health care. There's also a great social services team that offers amazing services. That's what's coming to mind right now. I think other things like advocacy, as well as community, shout out Algo, as well as like BTLA, Black Trans Leaders of Austin. Other intersectionalities, whether that be working with SWEET or SWAP, I can never remember which one it was. Sweet. But yeah, that's what's coming to mind right now. I think one of the biggest things when it comes to mental health care, if you are looking private practice wise, do your research, right? Someone can say they're gender affirming, someone can say they're queer affirming. That does not mean that they actually are, right? Do their research, see what's in their background. Don't be afraid to ask like very like snaky questions and be like, hey, hypothetically, I've called multiple organizations, I've called multiple people just being like, hypothetically, if you were to meet with a trans client, what does your paperwork look like? What does your intake look like? Be stealthy on behalf of your clients. Let's try to reduce harm, right? I did want to add a note, jumping back to the data thing. As a harm reductionist, mental health care providers, there's our notes and then there's our therapy notes, right? Be mindful of what you put in notes, right? Be mindful of the state that that note is being stored in and laws that are related to that. Yeah, sorry to jump back. That popped into mind.
Always a helpful reminder.
Gonna just reiterate what Maddie, the places Maddie named. Kind is a great resource for social services. Places like allgo as well. We have the Woodard Circle is a space for people living with HIV that we have, and we do collaborations with other folks in the community. So definitely do your research. We're trying to develop a database of client recommended places for gender affirming care and just safe spaces around town. So when the many denizens of Austin need resources, they can like go and look at names that come recommended from individuals within the community. So will be a community driven list. We have a hand back there. Okay.
Because we're with Kind Clinic and just in our community trying to create more peer-led, accessible groups in the community. So we have a peer training so that people can get trained to lead those groups, to start those groups. Because of the importance of lived experience and leadership there.
And that was Waterloo counseling and then a peer training group?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can find links for that under waterloocounseling.org.
Waterloocounseling.org.
Under services.
Under services.
And then my second was, can y'all talk a little bit about, so we want to be cautious with paperwork, what language we're using, what we are putting in the medical record. However, gender affirming care is medically based oftentimes. And so we do have to put certain things so that insurance may pay for care. So I guess just if you could speak a little bit to that balance of sometimes we do have to put labels, sometimes we do have to put specifics. We do have to write letters because right or wrong, we are the gatekeepers at times for whether somebody can get gender affirming care.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you completely, right? There are certain things that are necessary to include. My practice, when we're doing specifically like my therapy, like session note that does go into medical files is broad, right? Very broad. Only really you and your client and maybe like your clinical director should understand like what it says. So that could be like talked about topics of gender, period. You know what you said, your client knows what you said, and it has been put into the note. I agree with you additionally on the gatekeeping of the things that are needed for gender affirming care. For example, like letters of support, whether that is for surgery or obtaining HRT. those are things that you do need someone who is licensed to write. Licensed, has degrees, has training, all of that stuff. Certain things are required to happen, and I would implore you to look at WPATH. The world, right?
The world, hold on, I'm just going to Google it because otherwise we're going to get the letters wrong and we're going to look real silly. We just always call it WPATH.
WPATH Standards of Care Volume 7 goes into very specific outlines of what's needed for that. Read it, be familiar with it. Don't be afraid to write a letter. If you don't know how to write a letter, reach out to OutYouth. They do it all the time, as well as Kind Clinic. Y'all do it all the time as well. Ask other organizations. We're here to help. But specifically when it comes to putting things in notes and stuff like that, protect your client, but also like protect your livelihood, right? Those two things have to coexist. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH. Thank you. But yeah, get familiar with that, as well as not only your personal practices when it comes to taking notes and putting stuff into files, your organizational standards, as well as the standards in your state, whether that is Texas or if y'all are anywhere else in the world. Become familiar, find your way of reducing harm. Understanding that at any point a court judge can subpoena those notes, and at that point you can't go back on what you said. Yes, thank you for asking that question so that I could clarify. I really appreciate it. And also shout out to Waterloo.
Yep, and an important distinction there. I may seem alarmist because we should be alarmed. I am not advocating that you lie. I'm not advocating that you don't do the parts of your job that you're supposed to be doing. What I am saying is don't collect and store information that is not necessary for the provision of care. Which, if you all hate paperwork as much as I do, I assume you're not doing that anyway, but it always needs to be said. Some other things to keep in mind. We have talked a lot about medical and mental health service provision. We also need to talk about social service. Number one call we get at OutYouth. Where is the OutYouth in my community? There isn't. There's one. It's in Austin, Texas. But you can always refer people to Centerlink, which, I hate it when I compare it to this, but this is what they are. They are the Chamber of Commerce for LGBTQ centers across the world. So if you go to lgbtqcenters.org, they have a really handy search function where you can help folks find a community center near them. Now you might be saying, well, what if the community center doesn't provide medical or mental health support? They may not, but they may know people in the community who do. And even more importantly, what we have to combat is social isolation. People are dying because they are socially isolated. So if we can connect them to community, that gives us time to bring those other support services online. One interesting fact that came out of some research a couple of years ago, a trans youth that has no support, not one supportive adult in their life, has a risk of 88%, suicidality risk of 88%. If that trans youth has one supportive adult, be very clear, one, it drops to 4%. This is why social connection is so critical in the work that we do. And that is true of adults too. Now, nobody's doing that kind of research on adults as far as I am aware, at least that in depth. But that is the power that you have. You could be that one person. And all you really have to do is listen. Another piece that's really important here, we can refer you all day long to folks that do HRT, medical intervention, healthcare. But what happens when you're the trans person who needs an ENT? And you go to the ENT and he says, you know that ear infection you've been having? It's because of your estrogen. I'm like, I'm not a doctor, but that's not how this works. So it's also important to have a network of doctors, which it sounds like something that allgo is doing.
Yeah, actually, it's not just allgo. It came from Pride in Black. We're working with Kind Clinic and just trying to create a list of doctors that come recommended or just give gold stars to people doing their job and making sure that they're creating a space that allows people to feel safe.
That's great.
Well, that has been addressed, but thanks for bringing that to our attention. That'll be something we think about with that as well. Thanks.
I'm going to ask a question back to you. Do you find that geriatricians are generally open, affirming?
You know, we don't have one doctor that handles most of my trans clients.
Okay.
One doctor in all of Houston.
I was just in Houston, so
Shout out
that's
to that doctor.
scary. For those joining us virtually, there is one geriatrician in Houston serving the entire trans population there. Terrifying. And again, like Maddie said, props to that doctor.
Yeah, shout out.
I want to underscore that. For me as a trans person, my gender-related care is largely taken care of at this point in my life. So is my HIV. But I didn't go to a dentist for 3.5 years because I got misgendered at the one that I'd gone to prior to transition again and again and again and again. So I just didn't go. And what it took was asking the community, where can I go that I can just get my teeth cleaned and not have to deal with the whole gender thing? Because contrary to popular belief, trans people don't love thinking about gender 110% of the time. In fact, it gets kind of old after a while. So it is important to have these care networks that will address the whole person, regardless of their gender identity. That's the end of the questions that I was asked to prepare for the panel. Now I'm going to open this up to questions from you.
We did have one question from online.
Oh.
Please repeat what those links were for the trans resources. One was something center.
Yep. So CenterLink, the world organization organizing all of the LGBT community centers, can be found online at lgbtqcenters.org. And then WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, can be found online at wpath.org.
Thank you so very much. Roger, I'll come to you first.
First of all, thank you. Thank you very much for what you've shared. And I want to give a special shout out to Jaryn. A few years ago, a dear friend of mine who was going through transition, you met with her and her mother, and you were most caring. I should have waited for that to be the end, but just a couple of things, because there's also one of the things at Age of Central Texas, where I have the pleasure of working with Rob and Donna. A couple of years ago, Rob had this a really wonderful plan of starting an LGBT caregiver conference. And we've had it 2 years now, and it's been a real gift to so many people who have come to it. And we're, of course, going to continue. But also there's for me as a person that comes out of the faith community, I think oftentimes faith communities and the transgender communities particularly seems foreign and very far apart. And it is in many ways. But I have to say, in this town, first of all, my own church, St. David's Episcopal Church, a couple of months ago, we had a member of the seminary community, professor, who came and spoke about transgender and theology, spirituality, and it was wonderful. But also St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church here in Austin, several months ago started, it was called, first they called it Overturn the Order, and it was talking about the things that the state, House and Senate were doing. And out of that, St. Andrews started this support group, which was first called Overturn the Order, is now called Embracing the Transgender Community. If anybody's interested in knowing more about that, because I'm sure some of the people that we care about are also part of the faith community, have struggled with it, have hated it, and understandably have. But just so you know, there are people in this community, in the faith community, who care. Finally, this is a shout out. She can't hear this because she lives in Kentucky, but there's a dear friend of mine who's a Catholic nun. Now you're wondering, Catholic nun? But 25 years ago, she felt the call to work in the LGBT community, and most specifically in the transgender community. For 25 years now, she has been doing spiritual direction and presentations in the Catholic transgender community. One might wonder, why would anybody want to be Catholic? But they are, and she singularly does amazing things. If you're interested, I have several presentations she's given. One recently, which was a great interview, explained it even more than I understood transgender and spirituality. So I'd be happy to share that with you. She's trying to retire at 80 years old, and the transgender community that loves her so much just refuses to let her do that. So she continues and continues doing it. So again, thank you all.
Roger got me started. I was going to piggyback off of a lot of what you said. If we talked about spiritual care already in the community as a resource, I was either in the bathroom or fantasizing about pad thai still. Thank you, Jenny. And so I just wanted to bring up too, as far as spiritual care goes, and Roger last year grabbed me and showed me all the pastors in the room. I don't know who else is here except for you and I. We do have a couple of resources here in Austin, Texas, but also nationally for people to take note of. Me being in the United Methodist Church, I made it a point in 2020 when I started my ordination to say, do not waste my time if you will not place me anywhere that is not affiliated with the Reconciling Networks ministry. That is a branch out of the Gay Christian Network community. And I said, forget it. Don't even bother pushing me before the bishop if we're not going to do this. And so I belong to St. Luke United Methodist. We are one of the first churches in Austin to belong to Reconciling Ministries, but there are so many. Go online, you'll find so many. The other resource too is the More Light Presbyterian branch, comes out of the PCUSA movement from the 1970s, been around for a long time. And I'm a graduate of Austin Seminary out of UT, and we are a Presbyterian-based seminary. And I remember in spring of 19, when I lived in Hyde Park, one of our students who just graduated last year is trans, and they were sitting in my living room trying to find a queer affirming seminary. And they grabbed me afterwards and said, well, I'm trans. And I said, really, I couldn't tell, you know. And they said it was the first community they'd found that actually made them feel welcomed and part of that. But also too, at St. Luke, I have my first trans student who out of ILIF's School of Theology in Denver, who's working with us right now, because we are therefore inclusive and such. So you don't always think of spirituality and this, but there are definitely resources out there. I know the Metropolitan Church is huge. They've got a lot of campuses here in Austin as well. Unity Church is another big affiliation of spirituality. So it is out there. And more importantly, we are also noticing that in hospice care, where we come out of, you're finding more and more spiritual care workers that are willing and able to work with this community.
Also very blessed, if you don't mind mentioning this, sitting over here, an amazing pastor, Pastor Carl Gronberg. Can you wave your hand so people see who you are? He is just an amazing individual. If you get to know him, you will love him, as I have. And he has been very supportive of our conference for several years now. So thank you.
Yeah, Pastor Carl with Gethsemane Lutheran Church here in Austin, who are actually our lunch and our breakfast sponsors today. So if you'd ever told me that I would be producing an HIV conference with a church as a sponsor, I would tell you you are insane. But they have now for 3 years been our sponsor. They also have a mental health ministry in partnership with NAMI, Texas. So that's another wonderful thing to tap into. And as you mentioned, also Uprising Church, that was the Metropolitan Community Church, the MCC that we've known for many years in the community. They also have a lot of great resources and ministries as well. Any other questions? We've got about 20 minutes left. Claudella, I'm coming back to you.
So while you walk back there, I will also mention that OutYouth is while not a religious organization, a spiritual organization, has connections to many. And we have helped many families throughout the years connect to their faith or reconnect to their faith through other folks in the community and around the world. So that is a resource that is available to you.
I did want to mention as well, I'm appreciative that we are talking about the intersection of being queer and trans and being a spiritual person, no matter how you identify spirituality, whether that is religion or just the like wide spectrum of spirituality from like crystals and like all that fun stuff to like indigenous practices and stuff like that. I want to point out that the loss of a spiritual community, it also falls underneath that ambiguous loss thing. And has been shown to be incredibly detrimental. So I really appreciate everything that all of the pastors and spiritual guides and anybody sitting in the room who does this work. So thank you so much. And please don't ignore that intersection. Do not ignore that intersection, because people lose family members, people lose a whole community that is seen as family, right? And people lose something bigger that exists in spirituality. So I appreciate that. I know that you have a question back there, so I don't want to go over that.
Hi, the question's for you, and I'm not sure if I can word this appropriately, but earlier you expressed, I don't know, disappointment, I guess, that the UPS or FedEx or whoever dropped off a package and called you miss, and you were upset with them. I mean, you know, well, it's appeared, that's how I took it. Okay, so, and as we know, things changed, as you said, even daily. And so how do we know and how do we expect everybody to keep up with all the pronouns and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate? I mean, how would you have liked for them to have addressed you? Maybe that's a better question.
So, excellent question. My frustration in that moment was with the board member who was asking me, aside from bathrooms and locker rooms, what gender spaces do trans people occupy? I'm like, the entire world. As an example, I was gendered outside my front door this morning, and it was fine. It was affirming, read my gender presentation correctly. But you do bring up a good point, which comes up in conversation all the time, especially in Texas. What am I supposed to say instead of sir or ma'am? Nothing at all. I know that we've all been trained into it. It is really hard to get out of, and you're gonna have to give yourself grace as you mess it up. And you're right, the number one thing that I hear from adults is the language changes all the time. How am I supposed to keep up? As best you can. The language is always going to change, and this is not just this community. It's not just this generation of teens. You can go back. I tease my grandma all the time about words that she used that her mama hated because they were not appropriate words for a teenage girl to be using in the 1950s. So this is not a new phenomenon. If you are looking for help and support around vocabulary, I would refer you to Tumblr, but I'm not going to do that. I love that there were knowing head shakes across the room, so don't do that. My favorite resource right now, especially for professionals, is the GLAAD Media Guide. The gay and, well, I guess it doesn't stand for that anymore. Most of these organizations that had gay and lesbian whatever in them no longer go by that acronym. But GLAAD is a media awareness and media advocacy organization, and their media guide they wrote for press and media outlets to teach them how to talk about our community. And that's always my default. It's like, if you can just keep up with that, and they release a new one every 1 or 2 years. But as Maddie pointed out, another thing that you can do is just ask people how they want to be referred to. And that's just basic common decency, in my opinion.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's nothing wrong with just simply asking, how would you like me to refer to you? And it's just a basic question of politeness. We've talked in other sessions about the word queer, that a lot of the younger generation have recaptured that word and are using it. However, for the older generation, that is still a triggering word. And so, you don't want to just whitewash with your conversation on how do you talk about that. But let me ask this question, because we didn't really hit on this. In terms of pronouns, why is it so important that we utilize the correct pronoun for the person that we're talking to? Why is that an important thing to consider?
Yeah, pronouns are who you are, right? I mean, living in this society, specifically in Texas, right? Like, we are an incredibly gendered state. I was raised by a Southern mama who was also Hispanic and, like, also all of this other things. Everything's gendered, right? Pronouns are who we are, right? I mean, I grew up on ma'am and sir and all of that stuff. It took me a long time to let go of it, like a really long time to let go of it. I think when it specifically we talk about pronouns, recognizing that anytime you get misgendered, it is a act of violence, right? And majority of the misgendering comes from pronouns. And we can talk all day about grammar and stuff like that, but in reality, like, it's not that. The inability to use someone's pronouns, you can try and we appreciate trying and all of that, but honestly, it is a learned thing. Our brains are malleable, right? Meaning that we can unlearn and relearn. It's not hard. I mean, it can be, but if you're putting effort in, it's important. Something that I've used to tell people how it feels to be misgendered is, have you ever been poked really hard? Just like a really hard poke, maybe by a sibling who's like really pissing you off. I have a younger brother who is the youngest to a Hispanic mother. If you get it, you get it. I love him. Shout out Michael. But being poked really hard is annoying. But if you're poked over and over and over again in the same place, whether it's getting harder or staying the same pressure, you're going to bruise, right? And if it keeps going, skin is going to break, bones are going to break, everything's going to break. If we think about that in a mental health realm, every time someone is misgendered using pronouns, it hurts, right? Like Jaryn said earlier, like, it could be something as simple as reading your gender expression. Regardless, it hurts, right? And my mom being accidentally called sir on the phone, she was pissed. And I was like, she's doing better. Shout out to Caroline. But guys, I love my family. I'm using them as an example, but I love them very, very much. And they are trying. That's my viewpoint. Yeah.
Hold on.
If you're misgendered on accident, is that what you're referring to?
I'm speaking very broadly in regards to being misgendered. I can't make an assumption for the entire trans community, whether that is being misgendered on accident, being misgendered unknowingly, or being misgendered intentionally.
So this comes up often in conversation. I do agree with Maddie. Misgendering is a form of violence because it is perceived that way, regardless of intent. And this is where we come at what we try to teach our youth at OutYouth. Because how many of you work with, live around, have a teen in your life? How many of you had a teen in your life at some point? Yeah, so everyone in the room. Teens get real fussy when you call them out on their bad behavior. And normally their first response is, well, I didn't mean to. Good. Glad you didn't mean to. But what we attempt to teach our youth, and I think applies to your question, is there is absolutely a difference between somebody's intent and the impact, which is what Maddie's getting at. Your intent can be totally innocuous. I messed up. I do it all the time. I get paid to do this perfectly, and I misgender our kids all the time, not on purpose, but they still internalize the impact. And it hurts, especially more. I had this conversation with a young adult last night because I asked their pronouns in the space, and that became a whole thing. And we had a great conversation about it, but it speaks to this piece of it. Your intent does not matter as much as how it's going to be internalized, felt, and then lived with. Because for you, it may just be a simple mistake that may ruin somebody's entire day or entire week.
I'm going to make another analogy. So it's more like getting your foot stepped on. Like, you do that on accident. And so if Maddie steps on my foot and she says that she's sorry, oh, that's fine, but the pain is still there. So it, like, even though her intention was named, I'm still going to feel the sensation of getting my foot stepped on. And so I think that makes it a little more.
Yeah. And to add one more analogy, shout out to Caroline, my mom. It's like putting a nail in the fence. You can apologize and take it out, but the hole is still there. So I don't know if anybody else's mom used that, but that was like the biggest thing I learned. I see a hand back there. Yeah.
1 second. Hold on. I want to make sure folks that are joining us virtually can hear your question.
Is it important for people whose names and pronouns are aligned with their gender presentation? Is it important for them to say their pronouns in their email signature or when they present? And why is that? It's something that I've been kind of hesitant to do. So I'd love to hear from you why you may think it's important.
Great. Let's take email as a perfect example there. Our executive director at OutYouth, his first name is Aubrey. I have worked with the man for 15 years. Every piece of mail he receives, every unsolicited email he receives is addressed to Mrs. Wilkerson. So the importance of pronouns in things where you are not face-to-face and cannot perceive somebody's gender. I have always perceived that as a trans person, when somebody else has their pronouns in their email, as a sign of respect to me, because they are setting me up for success in our communication. Otherwise, I have to guess. And I'm not good at it. The other thing, and this may seem minor, but we've had a very interesting and in-depth conversation at OutYouth about where pronouns should end up in the email signature. Yeah, we have lots of fun. We have decided that moving forward, the email signature will be the person's full name, comma for any credentialing, one of those vertical bars, and then the pronouns. Because, as Maddie said, pronouns to trans folks especially are just as important as our names. Pronouns are a part of our name. They're how we identify and move throughout the world, how we want people to see, perceive, and treat us. Why do we do the bar instead of the parentheses? Because our identities are not an afterthought. So we have made this very intentional approach to how we are doing it, and we're trying it. We may change it later because everything changes all the time. But great question. I also really appreciate when a person I presume to be cisgender tells me their name and pronouns, even when that person feels like it should be pretty obvious. Because one, then again, I don't have to ask. And two, I know that this is a person who knows enough about pronouns that they're probably going to be safe to be around, and I don't need to have my guard up.
I also want to add a little bit, I think something that we all are aware of is that our gender identity is not the same as our gender expression, right? Like two different things, completely, maybe parallel, but completely different things. With that being said, like, I don't make assumptions. And I think specifically with putting pronouns in your everyday life, kind of like what Jaryn said, it's kind of like the same thing with being like, instead of being like, I'm an ally, just being like, hi, my name is this and here's my pronouns. Normalizing it is also an act of normalizing any gender identity, right? Specifically normalizing transness. Pronouns are important, and I'll say it again, they're who we are. It's how we communicate, right? Language is everything. So yeah, gender identity does not equal gender expression, does not equal romantic orientation, sexual orientation, all that stuff. It's all separate. So although I'm not the biggest fan of labels, I do recognize that something like pronouns is incredibly important. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah, I would just like to add, one of the things that I've, when I'm doing the education programs, I make the point that pronouns are something that we use when we talk about someone, not usually when we talk to them. And so we need to be very cautious about talking about people. And by giving someone their pronouns, they let you know how to address me when you're talking about me. Usually when we talk to someone, we use their name. I say, hi, Rob, not hi, he, him. So I think it's like you said, Maddie, words are very important, and our communication with and about people are very important. And I think that by giving somebody the information about what our pronouns are, we're giving them that space to say, this is how I want to be talked about.
Looks like we have time for one more question.
Yes, please.
I know most of us are in the healthcare space, which usually means as people age or elderly, a lot of us deal with the elderly. But as a mom of a 12-year-old, and those of you that put your hand up about a teenager,
Bless your heart.
I know, but I want to say for a message of hope, it's us, it's my age and older that struggle with this and that are constantly worrying about it. I have an entire house of 12-year-olds on any given weekend, and many of them are on their school ambassador, bringing kids into the school. And when those kids come to tour, this is a totally normal, I mean, if a neighborhood kid rings my doorbell, the kids will say, hi, I'm Jenny. What do you go by? What are your pronouns? Like they're also COVID kids, so they don't do this like we do where we want to shake. They don't shake hands, but they always ask, what do you like to be called? You know, they're not so into your name or what's on your birth certificate. Nobody cares. And nobody cares what you were born with. They ask, what do you like to be called and what are your pronouns? And it's just a part of introduction. They have these social skills that are setting up for tomorrow where we're struggling with, oh God, I called them her. And I feel like the kids of the adults of tomorrow, they have it figured out, and they don't struggle nearly as much as the older people do. So just a hopeful thought. I hear them asking each other all the time, and I'm like, this is so evolved, you know. But it's lovely, and I really think that that's the culture of these kids that are coming up, and they respect each other from the get-go. Yeah.
I'm drawing an interesting parallel between your question about, which we eventually got to, like, how do I get away from sir and ma'am, which we were right, like that's how you asked and respected people. That is how you showed care, concern, and love of another person. It seems like our youth are doing the same with new language.
I'm on the struggle bus whenever it comes to that, because gender is not something that someone in my age ever thought about. It's you, and ma'am and sir was always respectful. So what do you do in a situation when someone's gender presentation is different than their identity? Because I've had that in the healthcare situation where someone is very obviously looking like a male, but they want to be referred to as she and her. And I think we offended this person multiple times, not on purpose. And even in our private conversations during reporting off to another nurse, we're saying him instead of she. And so what can I do to be better about being respectful and not hurting someone's feelings?
Yeah, absolutely. And I commend you for recognizing and reflecting on that situation more, right? Here's the number one thing I tell people, right? I am lovingly called what they say is zillennial, where like I'm kind of on the cusp of millennial, but I'm also kind of on the cusp of Gen Z. So I grew up with people who were also struggling. And I also grew up with people who were like, yeah, we got this down, right? So like the 12-year-olds and all that stuff. Here's what I'll say. Try, right? That's the number one thing. If you mess up, that's apologize, move on, don't make it a thing, right? Like I don't remember who said that earlier, but thank you. Yes, it was you. Here's the one thing I will say. Although you feel as though you may not have been thinking about gender, I implore you to reflect on what gender looked like while you were growing up, while you were developing through your teenagehood. There's a certain conversation about what society has placed on quote unquote a woman and what society has placed on quote unquote a man. The trans community exists within that and outside that and against it and for it, right? Femininity, masculinity, all of that stuff is something that we are inherently taught. Yeah, and yeah, and that's something we were taught, right? That's something that's passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. And it has evolved, right? From, say, like my grandparents' generation, where my grandma was the only person in her neighborhood who had a business, but still couldn't have a bank account, right? How did that change to my mom's generation? My mom was allowed to be independent, could have a bank account, could own a business, did own a business, did do all of that thing. That was an evolution of gender. We are just continuing to do the natural thing of evolving, right? So if you think about it that way, gender has always been evolving. Gender has always been a conversation. Gender has always been something that is at the forefront of our minds, that is taught to us as we are developing, right? Because our brains are taught by other brains, right? That's the only way we learn, right? So I implore you to think about what gender was like for you and how it changed for you, and recognize that this generation, this young generation that I love with my heart and I'm also incredibly afraid of because they're scary at times, they're just evolving and they're just taking their turn and their shot at gender. And whether that's for it or against it, existing within it, existing in between, existing outside, that changing every day. It's just another evolution of gender. But like every evolution of gender up until this point, it is getting fought against, right? Like we look at any waves of feminism. I have certain thoughts about waves of feminism, but we don't have to talk about that right now. If you are interested in that, let me know. I love that topic. But recognizing that it does change, recognizing in different cultural communities, gender is talked about differently, right? Recognizing that that has changed. Everything is changing. We're always changing. And it's just this time that the trans community is no longer allowing us to be quiet.
I'm guessing we need to wrap up, but I don't want to leave out this person's experience, because I was her. I was visibly male presenting at a doctor's office and misgendered over and over again. And I cannot fully communicate the amount of bravery and gumption and vulnerability it took to walk in there. So this is not meant in any way to shame you or anyone else in the room who has messed it up. But I want to validate that experience. It takes so much sometimes for us to just leave the house, that if someone tells you who they are, believe them and do your best to acknowledge that. And know that you are not alone. My poor husband, we have a non-binary friend that Liam cannot for the life of him use they, them pronouns. And I'm like, dude, what is your problem? I do this for a living. You do it with me. My pronouns are they, them. Like, what is wrong? And he's like, I have no idea. I don't know what it is about this particular instance. But I would encourage you to try harder, and also know that when that happens, you may have lost that patient forever. And we are a very tight-knit community and word spreads fast. So that can also negatively impact your perception in the community and may cause you to end up off of lists that we maintain. OutYouth maintains list 2. So it's something to keep in mind. I don't have a perfect answer for you.
But I think that you did earlier hit on the perfect thing, which is give grace. Because, you know, as you said, it's changing. The culture is changing dramatically. And sometimes it seems like it's changing every day. And it's hard to keep up with it. And that's okay. And we're serving a lot of older adults who, as we said, they were taught it's black and it's ma'am and it's sir. But there are a lot of folks that we are serving that inside do not feel that way. And if we give them the space to say that's okay, be who you want to be, I'm still going to serve you equally. That's the most important thing. And so I hope that you got a few tools to help you in doing that. And if you make a mistake, acknowledge it, say I'm sorry, and just go on. The mistake happened back here. We're not going to keep dragging it with us. Leave it alone. Just keep going forward. I want to say thank you to this amazing panel. Thank you so much.